Thanks for the introduction and the invitation to be here from Professor Cook in the center, and thanks very much to Professor Berger for being here as well. Thanks to those of you who sat through a class with me earlier today, and a couple of you brave souls who sat through not one but two classes, and so this makes the trifecta for you. My wife thanks you for humoring me as long as you have. I want to begin with a story. As Professor Cook mentioned, I teach a class in law and religion, and every year we address the issue of school funding under the First Amendment's Establishment Clause. The big question there is where to draw the line for government funding of religious schools. And the key case is a 1947 Supreme Court decision about whether taxpayers can reimburse parents for the cost of bus fares to transport their children to Catholic schools. So everyone see the challenge here. The private Catholic schools have to get the kids there, and the parents want tax dollars to pay for the buses. And so the legal question here has confounded the courts for a long time. If tax dollars can pay for buses, then can they also pay for textbooks, prayer books, and Bibles? And if they can't pay for buses, then what about public roads and crossing guards near the schools? So because I'm a law professor and I make a living out of posing hypotheticals to my students, I threw one out to the class, and I suggested that the Catholic Church, as most people know, have restrictions of its priestly office to men, and that's a position that puts it at odds with some contemporary gender norms. So let's assume, I said to the class, that a city provided crossing guards to all of its public and private schools because it had good evidence that fewer kids died on the way to school with those guards in place. But the guards, of course, cost tax dollars. Could the city withhold them from the Catholic school simply because the school was out of step with so-called mainstream values? So I had expected, as I usually do, some back and forth with this hypothetical, but I was surprised when one student dug in. Yes, absolutely. The school has chosen to place itself outside of the acceptable bounds of society, and it's not entitled to any services of the state. So I pressed further. What if the school catches on fire? Can the fire department refuse to answer the call? Yes, the student responded. The school has made a choice. It can try to put the fire out on its own. Well, I said, what if there's an active shooter in the school? Should the SWAT team just stand down and wait for the shooter to finish? And the student replied, I don't see why not. Now, to be sure, this was just a classroom hypothetical, and there was actually a certain logic to the students' responses. If we're serious about the idea that government should not provide any aid to unorthodox positions or any support, then maybe we should go all the way with that presumption. But there is, for most of us, something pretty unsettling about the students' responses. And even if most of us would not push that far, plenty of people today call for the marginalization of their fellow citizens in other ways. We may not want to see schools burning or SWAT teams standing down, but we would just as soon see those with opposing views shut up or disappear. That disposition, the desire to shut up or shut down those who disagree with us, is pervasive in our society. It grows out of our inability to deal with the reality of our deep and irreconcilable differences, and the problem is getting worse. Think about the deep fractures emerging out of the current political season, the inability to find common ground that pushes many of our fellow citizens toward ever more extreme positions and extreme candidates. Think about your own visceral reaction, positive or negative, to words and phrases like labor union, evangelical, Black Lives Matter, conservative, progressive, Muslim, atheist. We Americans like to talk about unity. We see ourselves as one nation, indivisible, and in pursuit of a more perfect union. But much of our actual existence is characterized more by difference and disagreement than by unity. We disagree about significant issues of race, religion, sexuality, immigration, abortion, education, foreign policy, punishment. We lack agreement about the purpose of our country, the nature of the common good, and the meaning of human flourishing. Our differences pervade our backgrounds, preferences, tastes, and allegiances. They affect not only what we think, but how we think and how we see the world. The philosopher John Rawls famously called it the fact of pluralism, the recognition that we live in a society of a plurality of conflicting and incommensurable conceptions of the meaning, value, and purpose of human life. And our differences are not going to go away. We're stuck with the good, the bad and the ugly of pluralism and all that it entails. That description leaves us with a practical problem in need of a political solution. The philosopher Rousseau proposed one answer to that problem: it is impossible for men to live in peace with those they think are damned. I'd like to hope that Rousseau was wrong, and I'll offer a different possibility, which I call confident pluralism. Confident pluralism insists that our shared existence is not only possible, but also necessary. Instead of this elusive goal of unity, confident pluralism suggests a more modest possibility that we can live together in the midst of our manyness. That does not entail illusions that our differences are going to disappear. To the contrary, it forces us to pursue a common existence in spite of our deeply held differences. That doesn't give us the American dream, but it might help avoid the American nightmare. Confident pluralism offers a vision for how we might live together in society, and it takes both confidence and pluralism seriously. Confidence without pluralism misses the reality of politics. It suppresses difference, and sometimes violently. On the other hand, pluralism without confidence misses the reality of people. It ignores or trivializes difference for the sake of feigned agreement and false unity. Confident pluralism allows genuine difference to coexist without suppressing or minimizing our firmly held convictions. We can embrace pluralism precisely because we are confident in our own beliefs, our own groups, and the institutions that sustain them. The goal of confident pluralism is not to settle which views are right and which ones are wrong, but it proposes the future of our democratic experiment requires finding a way to be steadfast in our personal convictions while also making room for others who disagree. Instead of shutting down or avoiding those with whom we disagree, confident pluralism suggests that we allow space for meaningful difference, and with it, the opportunity for persuasion. It is a practical way for a society to function and even to flourish despite our divisions. And it includes both a legal and a personal dimension, which I'll talk about today. Think back to my students' comments. The inclination to shut a certain viewpoint out of the bounds of civil society begins with a personal antipathy, but it ends with a legal prohibition, of refusal to extend the protections of the law to one's adversaries, and ultimately an effort to turn the law against them. Our human nature and our history make clear that despite our wishes to the contrary, we all too easily embrace tendencies like this when we grasp power. How do we work against those impulses? Let's begin with the constitutional dimension. It might seem paradoxical to suggest that ensuring a confident pluralism means protecting more of the spaces where we differ the most. But we must have meaningful constitutional protections for both individual and collective action that dissents, offends, and agitates. These constitutional necessities are under pressure from both left and right ideologies that deploy ill-defined but rhetorically pleasing concepts like justice, morality, equality, and dignity to stifle them. It seems obvious that we should all want justice. Who wouldn't want a moral society? Who could be against equality? But as the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre has helped us to see, concepts like justice or morality or equality, abstracted from a particular tradition, have no limiting principle. They can be deployed to any political end. Consider the case of nearby Wellesley College. Wellesley now confronts internal challenges around its growing transgender population. Even though Wellesley only admits women, or until a few months ago did, a number of its current students have transitioned to men after matriculation. And a recent New York Times story asked, what's a women's college to do? As the Times recognized, Wellesley confronted the irresolvable conflict between trans students breaking their own gender barriers while trying to maintain the identity of a women's college. One student reasoned, I realized that if we excluded trans students, we'd be fighting on the wrong team. We'd be on the wrong side of history. But a recent Wellesley graduate reached the opposite conclusion. Sisterhood is why I chose to go to Wellesley. The New York Times noted that this woman asked not to be identified for fear that she'd be denounced for her opinion. Wellesley cannot remain a women's college whose identity in some ways rests on gender exclusivity and at the same time be open and welcoming to transgender students. It will have to choose between two competing views. But perhaps even more important than what Wellesley decides is how it reaches that decision. Will it be able to choose its own institutional identity, or will the government impose a norm on Wellesley through law and regulation? Will other citizens respect Wellesley's choice, or will they challenge its accreditation, boycott its events, and otherwise malign its existence? Will the process through which Wellesley reaches its decision be one of respectful engagement across deep difference, or will students, faculty, and administrators speak only under the cover of anonymity? In other words, will the outside world be respectful and patient and humble as Wellesley works through its questions of meaning and purpose? The question of whether Wellesley will be permitted to decide for itself brings us squarely to one of the constitutional dimensions of confident pluralism, which I call the voluntary groups requirement. The basic idea is that private groups, including colleges and universities and religious groups and social clubs that we form in civil society, are important spaces that are properly free from government interference, absent extraordinary, compelling justifications. Today's First Amendment law does not adequately protect the boundaries of the voluntary groups of our society. Instead of recognizing the importance of groups to the formation of beliefs, values, and identity, today's law forces groups into one of two frameworks. The first reduces groups solely to their public expression. It channels protections for them into our right to free speech. The second framework, less known, construes groups as associations of people, but protects them constitutionally only when they qualify as so-called expressive associations. The free speech framework focuses on the message that a group conveys, the words on a placard, the shouts of a protester, the physical gathering at a sit-in. The expressive association framework focuses on the group that enables a message by ensuring people can associate for other purposes. But this right of expressive association has kind of come out of nowhere. It's popularized today so that when I was working on an earlier book, I found 25 federal court opinions referring to the freedom of association clause in the First Amendment. The only problem being there is no such clause in the First Amendment. So it's ingrained in our public consciousness, but it is not originally found in our constitutional text. Neither alternative, speech or expressive association, is sufficient. Indeed, something is lost when we parse groups as either speech or association, as our current doctrine has done. We miss the inherent connection between a group's existence, its practices, and its message. This focus on expressive association also implies that some groups are non-expressive and that they do not warrant any heightened constitutional protection. That kind of distinction elides the fact that all associative acts have expressive potential. Joining, gathering, speaking, or not speaking can all be expressive. The focus on expression also undercuts other important First Amendment values like dissent, the protection of developing internal meanings and norms, the shaping of identity, and the importance of informal as well as formal interactions. We can see this play out in real life in some of the groups that courts have deemed non-expressive and denied protections to. They've been particularly unwelcoming of fraternities and social clubs, but they've also deemed as non-expressive motorcycle clubs, boxing clubs, and as if the punchline to a bad joke, a nudist colony deemed non-expressive. And we might think of ways in which a nudist colony could be expressive. For all of its troubles with these groups like fraternities and social clubs, the distinction between expressive and non-expressive collapses completely once we consider its online implications. Websites, blogs, and online forums are unquestionably expressive, and yet courts today have not sufficiently accounted for those expressive components and how groups should be protected in online spaces. We would do well to think carefully about the relationship between the legal dimensions of our online and our offline groups, particularly as our values, identities, and senses of meaning are shaped by our online experiences increasingly. In fact, it is already the case that reality for some people is constructed more online than it is offline. And even though we can point to extreme cases where that is clearly the case, the significance of our online groups and attachments is increasing for almost all of us. This right of expressive association is not just theoretically confused, it also weakens and obscures real protections for the voluntary groups of civil society. That doesn't mean that government can never interfere with groups, but it does mean that when it does so, it should do so tied to specific harms and credible threats. That does not provide an absolute protection for groups. For example, if law enforcement has credible information about a group or a practice, it should have the authority and even the responsibility to investigate, even at the cost of some First Amendment interests. But the government should specify its interest and the group. It should not be abstracted to unchecked levels. That's the voluntary groups requirement. A second constitutional protection is the space to voice dissent in government-provided spaces. These are called public forums. The physical and virtual spaces where citizens come together to voice dissent, opposition, and discontent. Public forums can be actual places like town halls or city parks, but they can also be non-physical or virtual spaces. Public colleges and universities create public forums when they allow students to form their own organizations. Local governments create public forums when they solicit comments on a website. Public forums are essential to our democratic experiment. They provide a mechanism for citizens to gather, express, and engage on topics and issues of their choosing in their own ways and on their own terms. This ideal of the public forum represents one of the most important aspects of a healthy democracy. It signifies a willingness to tolerate dissent, discomfort, and even instability in public. These intuitive connections were not lost on the writers of one of my favorite television shows, Parks and Recreation. In one episode, a delegation from a municipal Parks and Rec department in Venezuela visits the fictional town of Pawnee, Indiana. The delegation's leader, Raul, expresses dismay upon observing a public forum. "This is outrageous. Where are the armed men who come in to take the protesters away? Where are they? This kind of behavior is never tolerated where I'm from. You shout like that, they put you in jail. Right away. No trial, no nothing. Journalists, we have a special jail for journalists." And yet we are not as far away from Raul's vision as we might like to believe. The suppression of public outrage in Ferguson in the immediate aftermath of Michael Brown's death and the detention of journalists who covered the protests is only one example of the ongoing violations of the public forum in this country. Under current law, political protesters in public forums are often removed to physically distant and ironically named free speech zones. Labor picketers confront oppressive restrictions in public areas. Churches are prohibited from renting generally available public facilities. Occupy movement protesters in New York City parks, anti-abortion counselors on Colorado sidewalks, and political protesters in the North Carolina Capitol have all been silenced by government officials overreaching their authority in public forums. The public forum in practice is quite unrecognizable from its ideal, and that departure should give us great pause. This voluntary groups requirement and the increasing need to guard our public forums are two of the essential constitutional aspects of confident pluralism. We must insist that the people we entrust to govern us honor these basic principles. But confident pluralism also depends on us in the normative decisions we make every day without the constraints of law or policy, in what we say and do and how we interact with other people. These decisions also are an important part of the pluralist vision. They play out in the midst of our ordinary lives to a far greater degree than the occasional court decision that too often occupies our greatest attention. Confident pluralism builds upon three aspirations to secure these commitments: tolerance, humility, and patience. And as I was talking with some of you earlier, I mentioned I deliberately focused on aspirations rather than virtues to lower the bar a little bit. These words are not self-evidently confident. In fact, we might think of these particular aspirations as concessions or compromises. It might seem less obvious that we would want to pursue tolerance, humility, and patience in light of firmly held convictions. But it is in fact the confidence in our own views and beliefs in the midst of deep difference that allows us to engage charitably with others. Rather than lashing out or remaining in our own echo chambers, we can pursue dialogue across difference, even when, and especially when, we believe that our views are in fact the better ones. Let me spend just a few minutes walking through these aspirations. Begin with tolerance. Tolerance is the recognition that people are for the most part free to pursue their own beliefs and practices, even those we find morally objectionable. This is no small task, As the philosopher Bernard Williams has observed, tolerance is most needed when people find others' beliefs or practices deeply unacceptable or blasphemously, just disastrously and obscenely wrong. The basic difficulty of tolerance, Williams notes, is that we need it only for the intolerable. But tolerance does not require embracing all beliefs and viewpoints as good or right. Instead of an anything-goes tolerance, we can embrace a practical enduring for the sake of coexistence. But this will require the hard work of distinguishing people from ideas. Tolerance asks that we treat people with respect. It doesn't mean respecting all ideas. Every one of us holds ideas that others find unpersuasive, inconsistent, or just loopy. More importantly, every one of us also holds ideas that others find morally reprehensible. The tolerance of confident pluralism does not impose the fiction that all ideas are equally valid or morally harmless. It does mean respecting people, aiming for fair discussion, and allowing for the space to differ about serious matters. Humility takes us a step further. It requires us not only to recognize that others will sometimes find our beliefs morally objectionable, but that we can't always prove why we are right and they are wrong. Put differently, humility recognizes that some of our beliefs and intuitions rest upon values that cannot be proven or justified outside of certain traditions. This claim might be especially jarring for some, but this humility that I'm describing is based on the limits of what we can prove, not on claims of what is ultimately true. It should not be mistaken as relativism. Humility leaves open the possibility that there is right and wrong and good and evil. Our beliefs can be true and they can also be known. In fact, when we think about it, many of us know our beliefs even when we can't prove them, just like we know lots of things we can't prove. We know what we ate for breakfast last week. We know that we are loved and sometimes that we are not loved. This kind of knowledge also extends to our moral beliefs. We know that burning alive someone is bad. We know that helping a vulnerable child is good. Many of us are also confident about more contested moral beliefs, and we confidently hold those beliefs even though some people reject them. Humility does not impugn this confidence, but it calls for a recognition that our beliefs often stem from contested premises that others do not share. It also recognizes that our human faculties are inherently limited. Our ability to think, reason, and reflect is less than perfect, which leaves open the possibility that sometimes we are wrong. That's one reason that all of us, whether religious or not, live and act on a kind of faith in our beliefs. And finally, patience. Patience points toward restraint and endurance. It also encourages efforts to listen and understand and maybe even to empathize. We don't have to accept or affirm as we do that. And in fact, patience might lead us to a deeper realization of the harm or the error of someone else's viewpoints. But we can at least assume a posture that leaves open the possibility of conversation rather than caricatured dismissals. One practical way that this works out is in our speech and our words. The First Amendment allows us to say almost anything to anyone. We have that liberty even when our words injure the dignity and self-respect of other people. The First Amendment makes it difficult for the government to regulate expression that causes emotional or psychological harm, even expression like defamation or hate speech. But just because we can say almost anything doesn't mean we should. We might ask, for example, whether some forms of speech are especially pernicious to confident pluralism. I'd like us to think through two examples, what I'll call the hurtful insult and the conversation stopper. Start with the hurtful insult. Some versions of the hurtful insult, like those based on race, gender, and sexuality, are not fit to mention. Others remain more commonplace but can sting just as much. Fat, short, ugly, friendless, or to pick an example from our current political discourse, loser. The hurtful insult is often based on a person's identity or relationships. It aims for the most vulnerable and most exposed dimensions of our humanity. The hurtful insult might be false, misleading, or hyperbolic, but it might also be true. It could be fact or opinion, or fall somewhere in between. It could be spoken out of humor, spite, or malice, and it's almost impossible to regulate under the First Amendment. Consider, for example, racist comments that have been directed at campus activists in recent months, or anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant slurs surrounding some of our national debates. Many people condemn these versions of the hurtful insult, but as a legal matter, they are permissible. The hurtful insult is socially constructed, and it gains force and power by the cultural context that surrounds it. One of the consequences of this social construction means that the hurtful insult can change over time. This attentiveness to change in social meaning is one of the strengths of multicultural emphasis on language. And conversely, some of these changes are too easily dismissed by those worried about an overbearing political correctness. To be sure, the enforcement of language norms, particularly on university campuses and elsewhere, is an ongoing problem that rightly concerns free speech advocates. But an aversion and a protection of the First Amendment spaces of language norms should not distract us from recognizing the power and the harm of the hurtful insult. To the contrary, seeing this power and harm can lead us to a greater embrace of tolerance, humility, and patience. It can inform our choice of language for the sake of those around us. We can make similar choices about the conversation stopper. We see the conversation stopper in words like uneducated, closed-minded, intolerant, heretical, ignorant, backwards. These labels can also be descriptive, and they can wound. Their subjective effect on a person can cause hurt. But more often than not, they are meant to end a conversation. One of the most common examples of the conversation stopper today is calling someone a bigot. This version frequently appears against religious believers and groups that maintain traditional beliefs about sexuality, and you all here are not unfamiliar with this. The Boston Globe, for example, accusing Gordon of a bigotry that, quote, insults our intelligence because of the faith and conduct policy. Elsewhere, a blogger calls a Tufts University policy that allows campus religious groups to choose their own leaders a, quote, religious exemption to bigotry. The bigotry rhetoric pervades Facebook pages, Twitter feeds, and online comments. Now, some religious believers are bigots. They, to quote the dictionary definition, strongly or unfairly dislike other people, and they treat others with hatred and intolerance. But the bigotry label is not generalizable to all believers who hold traditional beliefs about sexuality, even those whose beliefs lead to discrimination and exclusion by private groups. The hurtful insult in this conversation stopper stigmatize people instead of critiquing ideas. They are often efforts to cast people beyond the pale, either for who they are or for what they believe. The hurtful insult says, I don't have to respect you as a human being. The conversation stopper says, I don't have to listen to you. Confident pluralism rejects stigmatizing people through our speech. At the same time, we need to do some work between distinguishing stigmatizing and causing offense. Even as we work to avoid stigmatizing others, we must maintain the space to make moral judgments of one another. Moral judgments can focus on ideas and beliefs rather than on stigmatizing people. Those assertions will likely cause offense, but they are an important part of our coexistence through deep and genuine differences. We fall short of the aspirations of confident pluralism when we stigmatize others, but we risk a false tolerance and a false humility if we insist that nobody be offended. And so, for example, I think some religious believers are far too quick to respond to critiques or to certain political or social pressures in this country with charges of persecution. In a deeply divided society, not all disrespectful words against religious believers and not all political decisions that disadvantage them are on the level of persecution. Religious believers and others have every right to engage in the public square and the public forum and to argue for civil liberties, but jumping too quickly to unwarranted defensive language like persecution can also end dialogue and wall off relationships. I've been focusing mostly on ways to avoid unproductive speech, but our speech can also build bridges across differences. It can give life and meaning to unexpected relationships. And as we think about what we say, we can also think of how we listen and think about our shared responsibility as both speakers and hearers. We are inevitably going to encounter both hurtful insults and conversation stoppers. We'll encounter other forms of harmful speech, words that trivialize or brutalize the things we care about, that cast the people and ideas that we cherish in uncharitable and unkind framings. But we can nevertheless choose to respond with tolerance, humility, and patience. The aspirations of confident pluralism can facilitate real partnerships across difference. We can find common ground even if we lack a common good. And this is not an unworkable pipe dream, but we can point, and we need to point to examples around us and in our own lives where we see this happening. And as we do so, we might pay attention to the fact that when we bridge relationships, we overcome a kind of difference, but it's not necessarily an ideological difference. It's not that people always grow closer to one another's views or work toward compromises and beliefs. Finding common ground does not require bridging ideological difference. It depends on lessening relational difference through civility, trust, and friendship that emerges through shared experiences. And those experiences are more often than not the stuff of ordinary life, sharing a meal, laughing together, or helping a neighbor. So I've given you a few thoughts about confident pluralism in both its constitutional and its personal dimensions. It's not the only political possibility. One alternative is a radical sameness that refuses to sanction or even permit difference, like the kind of difference viewed by some today as intolerant or bigoted, or in an earlier era, disgusting or heretical. That sameness, to be clear, is not just about social stigma. It is the impulse to push certain people beyond the acceptable boundaries of society, to marginalize them to the greatest extent possible, to wish they didn't exist. But people with deep differences do exist, and they are an inescapable part of our shared existence today. In most cases, the best way to deal with this difference is through persuasion rather than coercion, and by pursuing tolerance, humility, and patience, both in our laws and in our lives. And that's the goal in a nutshell of confident pluralism. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to the response and the questions.
Thank you. We'll have the response and then time for questions and answers. Dr. Berger.
Well, thank you very much. It won't be very easy for me to respond to this because I'm not a lawyer. I'm a sociologist. On many of the issues that Professor Inazu was talking about, I'm not very competent and I have no particular strong opinion. But I'll tell you where I come from. It seems to me the basic issue here is the issue between pluralism, which I can easily define, and religious freedom. You can have one without the other. If you combine the two, you get a very interesting dynamic. Pluralism things are what you want them to define as. Something Angel dictates our concepts in English or in Arabic. I define pluralism, which is close, I think, to what most people mean it. The coexistence within the same society of different religions, moral systems, and worldviews. How does this relate to religious freedom? You can have pluralism, you can have religious freedom without pluralism. A good example in my mind just occurred to me. I was making some notes of what on earth I'm going to say in response to you, is Iceland. Very small island. I think the total population is about 300,000, 400,000 people in the middle of nowhere. 95% of the Icelanders are Lutherans. I'm Lutheran myself, but it's a frightening thought. The highest rate of Lutheranism in Europe, one of the highest rates of out-of-wedlock children, and the highest rate of alcoholism. I don't know how the three are related, but that's another question. But you can also have pluralism without religious freedom. Well, there's religious freedom in Ireland. I suppose the other day I got a very interesting document, very promising document, of a large number of Sunni Islamic scholars who made a statement, in fact, in the form of a fatwa, of a religious judgment against ISIS. And they came from all over the world. I think the meeting was called by Al-Azhar University in Cairo, but they had people from everywhere. And to my amazement, I saw there was somebody from Iceland who had a kind of Arabic name, but I don't know what he's doing in Iceland. And I thought, how many Muslims would there be in Iceland? I guess they can probably have their annual convention in a phone booth. On the other hand, you can have, or you can try to establish religious freedom, establish a society in which there is pluralism, and no religious freedom. And unfortunately, there are a number of countries in the world today that are moving in that direction. Even staying in Europe, take Russia, which has a very democratic constitution now, which has become increasingly irrelevant. And the Orthodox Church is becoming more and more the state church, as it used to be 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago, almost exactly 100 years ago. But increasingly, it's with the Putin government, there's a very close alliance between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian state, and religious liberty is in question in Russia. Certainly, if you are a Protestant missionary, you'd have a big problem. The Catholics, Roman Catholics, and etc. The two are not necessarily linked. But when they are linked, they release an enormously interesting dynamic on the individual level and in terms of the state and the political and legal order. I'm not giving a lecture, so I'll be very brief. Tell you what they are, what I think the main consequences are. On the individual level, this is very important. It becomes difficult to take your religious background for granted because of something I call cognitive contamination. When human beings talk to each other, at least in a fairly peaceful way, they influence each other. And that means even if you were raised in an environment, social environment, let's say was totally Catholic or totally Muslim, totally anything, you begin to take it for granted. Of course, that's what the world is like. When you are surrounded by people who are apparently not insane, and they have different views, completely antagonistic to yours. If you keep on talking to each other, this is going to not quite, it doesn't mean you lose your own view of the world, but it becomes less certain. It begins to have an undercurrent of doubt, no longer taken for granted. You have to make some decision as to how to relate to that religion or that value system from which you come. Evangelicals, I'm talking about an evangelical institution, should have no problem with this conclusion. You cannot be a Christian the way you have an allergy. You have to make a decision to be or to stay or to become a Christian. That's becoming a universal condition under pluralism. Now you can try to reverse that, to re-establish taken for grantedness. And I think that's what fundamentalism is all about. Religious, political, what have you, ideological. You try to make things that you think are the truth to be taken for granted by everybody. That's very difficult to achieve under modern conditions because the others who think differently keep impinging on you. Very interesting dynamic. But if you, I talk about the individual implication. Certainty becomes difficult if it's absolute. There's always an undercurrent of doubt. You have to make decisions, which I think is very healthy. The other is that religious institutions, whether they like it or not, become voluntary associations. People are not forced to be in there, or at least even if simply pluralism itself makes it very difficult to have uniformity. That has enormous implications. It's very difficult for religious institutions that used to have a monopoly. And the Roman Catholic Church is a wonderful example. It has come to terms very successfully becoming a voluntary association, which totally goes against its theological assumptions. I won't go into details, a very interesting case. But finally, there's a problem of management. How does the state relate to all of this? And there are different ways of relating to this. From encouraging and even legally, politically supporting pluralism, making it possible, or to try to reverse it. I would say one of the most successful ways of managing the dynamic of pluralism is an institutionalized religious freedom. It doesn't have to be exactly the way the United States has it, I think the idea that the whole world is going to accept the First Amendment to the US Constitution translated into Russian or Arabic or Chinese is unlikely. And even in Europe itself, take democratic Europe, take Western Europe, there are differences. But what they all have in common is whether it's officially or unofficially, you have a religiously neutral state. Britain, United Kingdom, still has a state church. I won't go into details, but is there less religious freedom in England than there is in France, where you have a very strict separation of church and state? I don't think so. De facto, there is a separation. There is a religiously neutral government, which is in charge of this dynamic. I think that is it may take different forms in terms of constitutions and law, but some degree of neutrality on the part of government is very, very helpful to what? To manage this whole thing without civil strife. It's exactly 5 years ago that I gave a lecture in Beijing at Renmin University, which is actually where the higher cadres of the Communist Party, I think, as far as I know, are still being trained. And I talked about religious freedom, and I said, look, I believe in it as a basic human right. I think religious freedom is based on the fundamentals of human dignity. But even if I didn't believe that, if you don't believe it, if you were completely Machiavellian, all you're concerned about is to keep this thing in order, to keep it going. Religious freedom is one of the most efficient ways of doing this, which means a state which does not enforce one particular religion or one particular worldview. They all nodded. This was 5 years ago. Right now, I think with President Xi, they may not nod so freely if they are communist functionaries. But it's efficient. It's more efficient. Leave people alone, but allow them to express themselves. I always like to tell a joke, so I'll tell you the most pluralist joke I know. And since I'm talking in an evangelical institution, I'm not evangelical, I'm evangelisch. In German, this simply means you're Protestant. But Lutheranism is not evangelical in the American or English sense. I get along with evangelicals, that's another issue. I like evangelicals. But what some of you may have difficulty when I said it, if you listen to me at all, I said there'll always be an undercurrent of doubt. Absolute certainty becomes more difficult under pluralist situations. You can try to reinforce it, as the Russian government is trying to do, as I'm afraid the Chinese government is trying to do. It's difficult, it can be done, but an element of doubt. So I'll tell you the most pluralist joke I know. It's about a young American who went to India to find out about the meaning of life, as many young Westerners still do. I don't know what they find, but some of them think they found something. Anyway, he was told there's some holy man living somewhere in a cave in the Himalayas, and after an arduous journey, the young American finally gets there. And the holy man is sitting in a kind of religious trance with his eyes fixed on the distant peaks of the Himalayas. And the young American sits in front of him and says, my name is so-and-so, I come from Gloucester, Massachusetts, and I came to India to find out the meaning of life. And I understand you know what it is. Could you please tell me? And the holy man, still with his eyes on the different peaks, says, yes, the meaning of life is in a lotus flower. Young American doesn't say anything. I don't know what to say to this. But suddenly the forehead of the holy man begins to frown, and its eyes turn around and look at the young American and says, do you have any other suggestions? That is the pluralist joke. I think I'll stop now.
Just a quick comment to, it's a nice observation even within our own political history to realize that things kind of seemed, especially on the religious pluralism point, seemed to hold together when there was less pluralism. So the Constitution of Massachusetts in 1780 worked pretty well in terms of religious freedom, because it just so happened that, you know, it covered most Protestants, and that was pretty good for the society. But the challenge is with the increase of the fact of pluralism, and not just, I think you're exactly right to highlight the religious pluralism as a core point, and also the growing religious secular divide, but also important pluralist recognitions about race and gender and other categories of our diversity. And so one of the things I hear a lot from people trying to figure out the pluralist moment in what we do is something like, if we could just go back to a time when things were more coherent. And usually my question is, and when exactly would you like to go back to, right? Is it the 1950s? Because that wasn't so good for women and African Americans and gays and lesbians and others in our country. Or is it 1943 when my Japanese grandparents were incarcerated by the American government, right? So there's no sort of like magic golden day when it held together better that we can easily go back to. And so this impulse for, it is sort of, I think, an anxiety or a fear that grows out of the recognition of this difference. And descriptively, when you have a more homogenous society like Iceland, you have less of that fear, but we're not there today. And so we have to, I think, resist the urge that I hear from some people for this kind of nostalgia.
Look, religious pluralism is easier to manage than moral pluralism. I think you said something like this too. I mean, most people, if your neighbor, say if you're a Protestant and your neighbor is a Catholic, and if you were talking about your different traditions, you'd have big differences on certain issues, like contraception, for example. Well, as long as nobody tries to take your contraceptives away, and you practice contraception, you don't care that much if next door they have something that they don't do it or they don't believe it's a good thing. But if it's a matter of, well, you mentioned gays, lesbians. If suppose you're gay and your neighbor thinks that this is a mortal sin, that the government should stop, it's decadent, it destroys society, it becomes more difficult to manage this. Abortion is probably one of the best cases in terms of the United States. If your neighbor, if you are a free pro-choice person and your neighbor thinks that every abortion is infanticide, that's a little difficult. It becomes difficult to find and then a religiously neutral government or religiously neutral law that has to deal with this has to find what I call formulas of peace, where people can not only not kill each other, but at least have some sort of peaceful relations. Mm-hmm. Okay, I don't think I disagreed with anything you said, but I have a different angle on it.
Mm-hmm. Right.